Good morning, everyone. This is the September 2023 meeting of the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force. Oh, I see Mike. Did you have your hand up? You're muted, Mike.
I believe that was Mike Parker that had a hand up, but I saw him disappear.
Yeah, it was Mike Parker. Okay. Welcome to the September 2023 meeting of the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force. I'll start out by welcoming Bellingham Police Deputy Chief Crass in proxy for Chief Mertzig. And I assume Mike Parker is here in proxy for Greg Winter. And so welcome to you two. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. We'll call the meeting to order. I'll also inform the group that my co-chair Jack Hovenier is away and not available this month, so I'll be chairing and facilitating on my own. I also want to state at the outset, at the request of county legal staff, per RCW 42.17A.555, the use of public facilities, including this, to support or oppose candidates or ballot issues is prohibited. Members of the public and the legislative body are not allowed to speak in support of or in opposition to a ballot measure or individual candidacy during any open public meeting. Please refrain from raising campaign issues when addressing the task force. So I'm looking and I still don't see Kayla Schott-Bressler, the special projects staff for the executive, who has our first agenda item on the county's county legislative agenda. So I will move to the next topic and hope Kayla joins us. That is the task force leadership planning. And again, as background, we've talked about this once or twice, and it's come up in steering committee and one or two other committee meetings. Both Jack Hovenier and I are terming out as of our January meeting. The charter limits members of boards and commissions to 2 4-year terms. And that is what Jack and I are coming to the end of a run for. We have worked with the county council and other people related to the task force and county legal counsel about some possible workarounds, extensions, redesignations of those positions. None of those seem to satisfy council. Legal counsel, that is. And so reluctantly, Jack and I will end our time on the task force as official members. That leaves a vacancy for 1 or 2 or more at the pleasure of the task force leaders. And so there has been discussion in the steering committee meeting, and Barry, maybe you want to take part in this somehow, either leading this conversation or at least reporting on that discussion. But we're interested in potential replacements as chairs or co-chairs. A task that is I won't try to diminish it in the description. It's somewhat time consuming. It's somewhat broad reaching, depending on how good a handle you want to have on the work of the committees and so forth, attending committee meetings and talking to committee members and committee chairs, participating in the steering committee actively. So there have been a couple of items, and you'll see they're bulleted on your agenda. The possibility of requesting and perhaps contracting for professional facilitation for at least for the year 2024. Many of you who are early members of the task force recall that that was the original structure of the task force. We contracted with the Whatcom Alliance for Health Advancement for facilitation of meetings in the early days, and then discontinued that, and Jack and Jill Bernstein took over as the co-chairs. There's some mention of possible compensation for appointed members, recognizing the time they take from their regular work responsibilities. And we're looking for people who are interested in possibly taking on a leadership role for the continued work of the task force in 2024. This could be very different depending on the passage or defeat of the ballot initiative, and I won't speak any more about that other than the fact that it is interrelated with our work and will become more so if a Justice Project operations project comes into being as a result of that. So I'm interested in opening up a discussion. Barry, I'd invite you to add anything from the point of view of the steering committee or the council for that matter. And otherwise just open up a discussion on leadership. And I'll note the last bullet that we also have some expiring terms for other members. And so we are looking to recruit. Kayla, I see you came on. I'm sorry, we've jumped ahead of you on the agenda. Do you have a few minutes to go through that? Great. So anyway, Barry.
Yeah, Stephen, I think you nailed it. I think what the council will be looking for is guidance from this group and from the steering committee to help the council make some decisions around should we want to look into funding a facilitator and or compensation for any of those members like Stephen mentioned. So those will be council decisions, but again, we would look heavily upon recommendations from the task force. So I think, Stephen, I don't have any really more to add other than, you know, let's just have this discussion and see what kind of ideas we can generate.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Can you also add your sense of what the timing of this process would look like from the council end of it?
Well, the council would have to amend the ordinance. So purely from a council standpoint, we would need to have an ordinance that you would introduce. And then 2 weeks later, you could act on it and have a hearing. So it's pretty simple. We would just have to get the actual content of that amendment to the ordinance done, and that's where we'd be looking to the task force for some guidance.
So the potential for amending the ordinance would involve contracting for facilitation or compensation for the time of certain members. Is that where the change?
Yeah, it could. I mean, we would have to look at how we do that, what mechanism we'd use to get that implemented, but certainly there'd be something in the ordinance that would talk to that.
Okay. So the floor is open for any thoughts or suggestions or volunteered interest in leadership or ideas for possible members we could talk to and encourage an application for. Understand we're not making any decisions at this point, but the more discussion, I think, the better the outcome.
Stephen?
Yes, Seth.
Seth here. And this is a serious question. If the rules were changed and you were permitted to serve longer, would you?
I would consider that. I think Jack has declined. This is what we've discussed with county legal counsel, and the opinion we've gotten is that this term limitation is embedded in the charter, and it's really not subject to exceptions or any of the creative finagling that has been put forward so far. So there would be that persuasive discussion to be had first. But yes, possibly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Raylene.
I would want to comment in the fact that losing both you and Jack is a very sad thing for this group. The depth of knowledge and experience that both of you have, it's going to be a huge loss. And it's fine to appoint a facilitator and pay them, but to have somebody that doesn't have the knowledge and hasn't been with the task force and knows all of the items that have happened over the past year is scary. And I think that could be harmful to not have somebody that has that background. So it would be nice to have somebody that's been involved for the last several years for this position. And I would love to see you stay, Stephen. So if there's any way we could do that, I would like to see that. Thanks.
Thanks, Raylene. And I think the question of institutional memory and continuity are the important factors that caused us to look for so many possible ways of at least extending that for some transition period. Obviously, when we set up the terms, it was poorly thought out in the long run, and hopefully we won't run into that again. But we have this time, at least at the moment.
Thank you.
Other thoughts? Well, I see none. So I will just say this is, as Raylene and Seth both indicated, this is an important factor in the continued work of the task force and the success of that work. It is a time-sensitive question, so I would appreciate it if everybody would give this some immediate and careful thought and communicate, I guess, to Jill initially any suggestions you might have, and I add the new member recruitment question to the leadership succession question here. So communicate to Jill any people you have in mind, any thoughts you have, any interest, even tentative that you might have for yourself. And if we're not getting much input, we'll probably be reaching out to bug you personally and more directly so that we can move this question forward. Any last thoughts on anybody's part?
Well, I just come back to the observation around the legal interpretation, and there might be some appropriate creative way to look at that. I mean, if there's no one else immediately standing up and you're able to continue, there must be some kind of interim status that we can confer upon you for 1 year, and so that there's some ability to continue in the role, even just to get around the seeming legal limitations. So I would urge us to find a way to get creative in that interpretation so that you can stay on.
Okay, thank you very much, Seth. And Eric is listening, and it's his shop that that handles this. So I'm sure he took note of your comment. Mike.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for facilitating conversation about your own future. I just want to chime in on what Mayor Fleetwood said. I think there has to be some kind of a way, and I was racking my brain, and it's coffee addled, and I am not a legal scholar, but I can tell you from a standpoint of working with you over the years that this is not a time to take the foot off the pedal, so to speak. And I think the task force has continued to make good strides, and I think that it's in large part due to your stewardship and Jack's stewardship. And I think derailing that in any way is inappropriate. These are my thoughts and my comments. Obviously, I'm not speaking on behalf of Greg Winter, Opportunity Council. Just personally working with you, Stephen. It's I really think we need to find a way to make that happen, and whatever I can do to lend a hand in that, and in search or whatever that may be. And for new members, I'm happy to help as always, as you know. But I would just want to express some gratitude and appreciation. And for task force members who may not know, Stephen and Jack have just been tireless warriors when it comes to this work. And so whatever path we go forward, we want to be able to carry that same zeal and that same tenacity, because we deal with tough stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate those very kind words. Anyone else? Okay. So we'll flip back to the order of the agenda. We're pleased to have Special Projects Manager from the County Executive's Office, Kayla Schott-Bressler, here to talk to us about the tentative status of the county's legislative agenda, and to seek input and conversation from the task force that might inform the finalization of that. And welcome Executive Sadhu, and I see Tyler Schroeder joined also. So I'm sure that this will be a rich presentation. And just from our conversation at the steering committee, I just want to emphasize this is also an open and inviting conversation to seek the input from task force members. So Kayla, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I'm sorry I was late, everyone. It's good to see you. I know I've talked to many of you in various settings over the last few weeks, and some of you have heard this story from me. But for those who haven't, I'm really excited to talk to you this morning about the county's work on legislative engagement for 2024. The county has historically really focused on budget priorities in Olympia and has been really successful in bringing money back to the community. As we work towards the 24 session, we're going to be also focusing a little bit more on policy bills in Olympia that impact, our housing system, behavioral health system, criminal justice system, our land use regulations here in the county. And council has asked us to take a little bit more of a formal approach, engage with council a little more. And we're also really interested in engaging more with the county's advisory boards, which is why we're here talking to you today. We've already met with the Public Health Advisory Board and the steering committee of this task force. So I think we've got some good ideas. And then I also just want to add that the Justice Project Implementation Plan talked a bit about state advocacy. And so that's really informed where we've put some initial thoughts together. The council is going to finalize our Whatcom County agenda in October, November, which should give us plenty of time to socialize it with our state legislative delegation going into session. And then we're also going to be working really closely with the city of Bellingham and the port. And I know Mayor Fleetwood's on this call, and Mayor Fleetwood, we're talking to your staff about coordination. And I imagine we're fairly aligned on some of the priorities that we're going to talk about today. I see you unmuted, Mayor Fleetwood. Did you want to say anything before I kept going?
Just to say, good to hear, and we'll look forward to collaborating.
Great. So you can see the initial document in your packet that the executive's office shared with council, but I want to highlight the priorities that are probably most relevant to this group's work, and then also just hear from you about other ideas that we're missing at this point. So I would say our sort of main policy priority related to incarceration prevention and reduction is getting state funding for the jail-based health and jail transitions Medicaid waiver. This is a key piece of the Justice Project implementation plan. Currently, people lose Medicaid when they enter a county jail or state prison. And we would like that Medicaid to stay on. Fortunately, the Washington State Legislature has already directed the Healthcare Authority to submit a waiver to the federal government that would allow that, and the federal government has accepted that waiver. The legislature just needs to fund the state share of Medicaid, and then we as local governments need to work with the state to get ready towards implementation. The idea is that Medicaid would cover not only behavioral health and healthcare services in the jail, but also jail transitions, case management, services. So we're working with the Washington State Association of Counties on getting full funding for the Medicaid waiver. We're also really interested in collaborating with other local governments on funding for prosecutorial diversion, and the competency restoration work group that Perry hosted on Friday. We had a great presentation from the state about what their ask will be to the legislature to fund prosecutorial diversion programs. So we will likely join in on that ask with the hope that Whatcom County becomes a community to add one of these programs. We are also just going to be tracking all conversations related to Medicaid reimbursement rates, particularly for behavioral health services, to ensure that a facility like the county's upcoming 23-hour crisis relief center can operate in a sustainable way, and that the state is continuing to own its responsibility for providing behavioral health care to low-income individuals in Washington. We'll track policy bills related to competency restoration and the justice system, and support like-minded counties in their lead advocacy there. And then we will likely go all in on funding for affordable housing. The State Housing Trust Fund's the main vehicle for providing funding for low-income housing development in Washington State, as well as operations of low-income housing. So we will ask that the state increase the size of the pie there, and then we as a local community can decide how we want to prioritize our priority projects for that state funding. So we very well could select a project consistent with the Justice Project implementation plan for individuals leaving reentry housing, or priority population of people who are justice involved or have a history of justice involvement. We're also just tracking some regulatory conversations with the trust fund about making sure that their operations funding can also be used for smaller projects. Typically, they require projects to be sort of large apartment complexes that have a permanent supportive housing fidelity model. And as we look with some of the partners here locally who only have the capacity to take on smaller recovery housing projects, we want to also make sure we can access state funding to operate and pay rent at those facilities. So that's sort of what's on our list so far, and really eager to hear from all of you. It's still really early stages, and just would love to hear your ideas. Raylene,
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Thank you, Kayla, for that presentation. One of the items that probably we'll be discussing on the updates for legal and justice was the staffing levels at the public defender's office. I know that prosecution also has staffing level needs, and I know Maya mentioned Senate Bill 5773 at our meeting, and that may possibly assist in state funding for defense and possibly prosecution. Is that something that will be looked at, or is something that we can move forward on, because we definitely need that?
yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yes, on the county's sort of support agenda, meaning an issue we're not leading on, but will engage in and sign in support of, will be full funding for indigent defense. It's a state responsibility that has been redirected towards local governments, and the state needs to step up there. So we'll absolutely be advocating for that and coordinating closely with Maya and Stark.
Thank you.
Aye.
Kayla, thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the leadership. And I love having these conversations in September. So I would just want to thank you and the exec's office for kind of leading with that, as always. And last year, participating with advocacy, as an IPRTF co-chair, I'm happy to help whenever that's useful. I wonder, did you have kind of a deadline, or and you kind of in your own minds what your thinking is, and if you said it and I missed it, I apologize. But for getting feedback, because I think some members may not be here today and may have some thoughts they might be able to share with you. Would they be best directed to you, and should we include Jill? I guess is question one. And then question two, did you have kind of a time frame in mind? Because I know you kind of want to get things set, you want it to gel, and you don't want people popping in when the session's already going. So any thoughts you have on those two would be super.
Yeah, I think if we could get council to sort of sign off on our agenda and finalize conversations with the city and the port by the end of October, early November, that would be ideal. So any feedback until then would be welcome and can certainly be directed towards me.
Heather.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very exciting to hear about the priorities. As I recall, there's quite a bit in the Justice Implementation Plan that is reliant on state and outside funding. And what I'm hearing is that you are going to be advocating for all of that. And I guess I have a tangential question I'm curious about. Is the county committed to implementing that justice plan regardless of the ballot measure? Because so much in that justice plan actually wasn't designed to be dependent on the ballot measure revenue. So I'm just, it'd be great for us to understand that.
Yeah, Tyler, Sat Paul, do you want to answer that?
Let me say that Heather and everybody else on this meeting, yes, we are very committed to go ahead with whatever is in our capacity if the ballot measure is not passed. But I think we should not think in those terms. That's negative thinking, that if it doesn't pass. I just answered this question when I go out in the forums and things. I said, I have not put my mind to if it doesn't pass, because we want to make it pass. This is the best thing we can do. So I'll stop here. But Heather, we are, and everybody else, we are committed. This is what government is for the good of people, for good of our community. This is not a project. This is our obligation and duty to the public.
Kayla, seeing no hands in the moment, I'll just add my own thought that one of the key pieces is that supported housing piece. And I think we've learned over the last couple of years how specialized and wonky doing supported housing right is. So I'm a little bit unsure what the level of understanding would be in legislative seats of the requirements for that. So I'm just wondering if you're thinking of any sort of educational effort in regard to that ask. And the same would be the case for alternatives to competency restoration. I think when we talk to legislators, often we get sort of blank stares back because it just doesn't register what exactly we're talking about. So those would be areas that I think are key roadblocks for progress, initiative or not. They might require considerable spade work in getting traction in the legislature. Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think I've been involved with housing advocacy with the legislature my entire career, and it feels like things have really changed over the last 10 or 15 years in terms of the legislature's understanding and the election of housing champions into the legislature who can educate their fellow lawmakers. And I know our delegation here in Whatcom County really sees housing as a priority. So I think, yes, some education on all the pieces that are needed to make supportive housing work, but I guess I just feel like our legislature continues to go big for housing and has the understanding that they need. And what we need to do is educate our delegation about what's unique in Whatcom County, and to ensure that the resources they're providing to the State Department of Commerce for housing are usable here locally for the types of projects that we want to pursue. And Mike and others on the call who have been housing advocates, I let you chime in on that. I think the competency restoration stuff is way more complicated, and our legislature probably needs some more help from us there than on the housing piece. Mike, do you want to add anything on the housing part?
Yeah, no, I don't have much. I think you covered it really well. Stephen, you did as well. It's complex. On the other hand, it can also be simple. I think it depends a little bit on how you approach it, right? But one of the things that we have found, I see Jason McGill's got his hand up. I want to hear what he has to say as another housing provider. But one of the things that we found at Opportunity Council is often the skill sets to be great at housing may not make you the best at doing the behavioral health pieces or the SUD treatment pieces. So it ends up looking like a collaboration of many organizations. And that's part of the complexity, is getting all of those things to fire on the same cylinders and marching to a similar beat that will assist people in recovery. I think there's total hope for justice involved people in housing. And Kayla, you know, I beat that drum all the time. And I think it's an equitable thing to do. I think it's the right thing to do. And I think the mess is figuring out those relationships to make it all happen. But when it happens, and we've seen it in our community and it works, it's amazing. So not a reason to stop. And when it comes to education, I think you're right. And Kelly, I didn't hear you mention, but Low Income Housing Alliance does a lot for education about supportive housing, because I think you're right. I mean, I think legislators to benefit from that education about the complexities of the needs that the people face, right? And that housing needs to be able to support all those needs and all the aspects of a person and all the identities of a person in housing. So I don't know if that's exactly what you were looking for, but certainly eager to help. And if we can provide education, and we're students too and learners as well. So we're here in all of those phases.
Thank you, Mike. Over to you, Jason.
Yes, thanks. Kayla, great presentation. Thank you so much. And what Mike just said is spot on. And also what you said as far as the, our state legislators, they're already housing champions. It's not convincing them. It's really educating the community. So I appreciate you highlighting that. I guess my only question, or maybe it's a comment, is on the county side, is when you're doing your advocacy, when we look at affordable housing, we kind of lump everyone into the same category. And at some point, this community is going to have to separate young adults out from adults. It's completely different on how we should approach it. And I'm not seeing that from the county yet. And I would love to see more of that advocacy as far as, and this is the only community that I know of that doesn't separate the demographic or the age demographics out from each other. And when it comes to the Housing Trust Fund, I didn't hear anything as far as like working with housing partners, because, as each organization, we also have our own housing plan and how we want to approach this. And the Housing Trust Fund at Northwest Youth Services, we've tapped into that numerous times. And I would hate for there be a competition or a conflict of like, we're submitting this application, but the county is also doing the same thing and we're not aligned. So that's why I think it's important for us to all get on the same page as far as, these applications that are very daunting, as you would imagine, and takes a lot of effort to submit those applications. And yeah, there's plenty of money out there. It's just, how do we, as Whatcom County, comes together and really works together as far as what our housing plan, and also how does it look for young adults as opposed to adults? So I would love to hear more about that in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. Just as far as like the pipeline coordination and trust fund application, the county isn't going to submit a housing trust fund application itself, but rather work with community partners. So I think it's about us coordinating with all the local housing agencies through that housing pipeline group and our housing advisory committee to make sure that we're teeing up sort of a placeholder project for justice involved individuals and recruiting and a local agency or statewide agency who wants to take that project on. So definitely want to be part of that coordinated conversation. And then on the youth housing, I'd be really like eager to hear what Northwest Youth Services state housing advocacy priorities are. I know sometimes there's separate pots of money for youth. And so anything we can do to echo your voice in Olympia, we would be glad to do so. So if you feel free to shoot me emails as you guys work on that and work with your state partners in the youth housing world too.
Mike.
This is kind of, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Kayla, and thanks for Jason. This is kind of just allied. I would just mention, Stephen, a little bit about the conversation that the exec's office and the steering committee had about a future presentation. And I just want to put a plug in for members to stay tuned. We are looking to bring a presentation about a social impact bond initiative that was done in Denver. And one of the things we want to do is learn, how did they do that? What did they learn from that? And to Jason's point, you know, how well does it work for all members? Did they kind of divide that up? But pretty exciting stuff to think about, maybe a new tack and a particular focus on justice involved folks. Just from my standpoint, I think that's a huge missing area that we could do. I think we do fairly well with families. But, you know, the numbers increase all the time for every population subgroup. So whatever we can learn about leveraging those housing trust fund dollars, but also private enterprise. And so one of the things that I get particularly excited about is that. So hopefully in an upcoming task force meeting, we'll learn about that as a community. And to Jason's point and to Kayla's point, hopefully we can kind of germinate some new activity and some new housing development that's really focused, equity focused on folks in our system.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate your recalling that and bringing it in front of the whole group. Other thoughts for Kayla? Okay, I see none. Got off easy, Kayla.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free. I'll put my email in the chat. You probably have it, but feel free to email me and happy to update the group again as conversations with the city and the council and the port move forward as well. So just let me know what you need.
Thank you. And if there are alterations or other iterations, additions, key focuses that come up as you start polishing this in final form, we'd welcome updated reports as well.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm going to sign off for the rest of the meeting, but I think you all know where to find me.
Okay, thank
bye.
you very much. So the only remaining substantive item on the agenda are the committee updates. And Caleb, glad to have you here. I didn't think we were going to be able to see you. You look very dapper. And wonder if you would kick us off with an update on the index committee.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everybody. Just to note, I was not at the meeting. I was sick that day, so I appreciate those of you that were there. It was an unofficial meeting as we didn't have a full quorum. But Riley brought forward an idea that a survey could be sent out to law enforcement and EMS partners for utilization or underutilization of the Andean Center for Hope. There was a discussion centered around that idea, and a couple of different things were brought forward. One of them was to get an education piece to both our law enforcement partners and EMS partners in the community that may not know about what services are offered at the Andean Center for Hope. And then some potential barriers were brought up, things like lack of space, sometimes the time it takes to have an intake process, and some of the restrictive behavior criteria for some of the issues that were brought up. But they ultimately decided that if an education piece were to be sent out to law enforcement partners, that there could be a potential for having a survey follow, so that we would see increased, at least potential increased usage for that center. So that's the broad brushstrokes, and I know I'm going rather fast, but I wasn't actually there, so this is just from the notes. So if I missed anything, or if I give something not quite the importance that it deserves, somebody jump in who was there. Harry.
Hi, Caleb. Thank you for the input. Just wanted to give a little bit of information. We have a Andean Center for Hope Crisis Stabilization Center Advisory Committee that meets once per month on the first Monday. And we touch base on a number of things, including utilization, bed utilization, et cetera, for the last month. I typically compile that for a quarterly basis. So I have that data, happy to talk with you or others about it. I also you may not have seen it, but I've also printed up visor cards for law enforcement, sort of the boots on the ground individuals. And it's like, I don't even know what the number is, or I'm not sure exactly how to use it. The admission criteria, I got somebody, but I'm not sure, I've never used it. And that was the purpose. One side of that card is specifically for, how to call and just get an individual that it's like, I'm interested in. And essentially the purpose was, is there a bed available? Because I don't want to take somebody over there if there's not a bed available. I need to know that right now. Otherwise I've got to look at alternatives specifically for first responders and law enforcement. And so those just recently went out maybe a week ago or so, but I've gotten some responses from the various law enforcement agencies within the county that said, hey, thanks, I got those, and that's really helpful. I am absolutely more than happy to be a part of a meeting and just, informational, sort of educational component. And I've gotten some great feedback, honestly, from law enforcement, just in terms of the challenges that are there. One of the pieces, and I'll sort of make reference to this because I was talking with somebody else about it for what value it is. And that is that one of the pieces that I think that most folks are aware that the detox services are provided by Pioneer Human Services. Our mental health triage is provided by Compass Health at the facility. And originally, one of the things that was sort of happening with the time frame for drop off for first responders, but particularly law enforcement, was keeping that, obviously very short. And I really sort of dove into that and said, why are we having sort of more lengthy times? And I think that one component of that was that if the individual, for one reason or another, did not meet criteria for admission to the facility, that has a lot to do with licensure. But at any rate, if they didn't meet criteria, I think the concept and the idea of the providers was, well, we need law enforcement to take them wherever they need to go if they don't meet this, admission criteria. And I'm pushing back against that thinking, because that's really expensive transportation, and we have now other forms of transportation. I think that maybe you've heard about. We have a behavioral health aide that was recently brought into the Response Systems Division that has a van and is providing transport, and et cetera. That's a relatively new position, but my point being that it's like, no, it's okay if this individual doesn't meet this criteria. We have a way of getting them there that doesn't include the officers, the deputies that have brought the individual to the facility. So, some of those sort of more recently developing pieces that I would want to, to converse with as well. The other thing that I'd love to talk about is 12-hour law enforcement holds that we are actually staffed up for and have licensure for. I guess I won't say I understand. I certainly have heard some feedback relative to law enforcement saying it's a voluntary facility. So how can we possibly do 12-hour law enforcement holds? Well, I'm a clinician, so I'll just own that up front. And it's like, well, we haven't necessarily tried yet. Yes, there would be a percentage of individuals that might leave the facility before the 12-hour hold time was up, which is really what the statute talks about. But we also, it's a pretty nice place, pretty good food, private room. There may be a number of motivating pieces for an individual to, to remain. So anyway, I'd love to talk about some of those pieces, Caleb, and I know that you're taking on a new position here in the near future, and I'd like to develop my relationship with you relative to the Ann Deacon Center for Hope and, and those components. So that was just a shameless pitch for myself. I'll stop now.
Excellent. I think that was really informative, and I think it helps some of our law enforcement partners who are on the call, who are listening with keen ears, I'm certain, to the things that you've developed there. So it's good to hear. Sounds like some resources that are in development or have been developed should be useful in the near future. I imagine we're going to have some follow-up on in our next meeting, which is, I believe, October 5th. And that's we should have some product to deliver for that meeting in terms of a discussion between now and then, Perry. So Dan, was that
Dan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the change in that 12-hour hold and why that happened, and if there's a possibility of any lengthening of time for that, given if folks are experiencing a substance use disorder issue, and for the clearance of the for any drug to leave their bodies. Just how does that work?
So the 12-hour hold is actually outlined in RCW 1031-110. I think, don't quote me on that, but I believe that that's correct. And it does specify 12 hours. However, I appreciate the question, Councilmember Hamel, because it's not limited to that. We would certainly continue to work with the individual relative to, from a clinical standpoint, for that individual to remain at the facility for the length of time necessary to address, whether we're talking about detox or whether we're talking about crisis triage. So, the coverage is there. The individual's requirement, as per the statute, is over in a 12-hour period of time. But, again, the staff are going to be using evidence-based practice in terms of a harm reduction and trauma-informed care and, support of the individual, motivational interviewing, those kinds of things to continue to engage the individual. And again, fairly nice setting, pretty comfortable, pretty low key with, good food and a private room at this point. And so I think that oftentimes individuals, considering treatment services, that's pretty scary. I may have not done this before. I don't know if they're going to, what they're going to do to me. And so probably, honestly, that period of time would also be, sort of recognizing and experiencing that process. And so it can be certainly extended. Average length of stay at the Ann Deacon Center for Hope at this point is 3 to 5 days. Individuals can remain longer. Medicaid will cover that if there's justification. Medical necessity is essentially the term that's used. So I really appreciate the question, because we're hoping that what initiates as a 12-hour law enforcement hold that is diversion from being, taken to jail, could turn into a longer length of stay with the possibility in detox of referral to an inpatient treatment facility if the individual is open to that, followed up by, again, appropriate level of care, et cetera. So hope I answered that question, Councilmember Hamel.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Perry. Raylene?
Perry, just to clarify some of that on the 12-hour hold. If it's an involuntary hold, the person is likely to harm themselves or others, and they're combative, and they're coming off substances or other issues, they still wouldn't be admitted necessarily to the Ann Deacon Center of Hope, is my understanding, if they're combative. And that's what law enforcement is dealing with a lot of times. And that's where they would end up bringing them to the hospital on an involuntary, where those individuals wouldn't be able to walk away from the facility. Am I correct on that?
You are absolutely correct, Raylene. The best way that I can put it, from sort of in my head anyway, using law enforcement language, is that the licensure by the state for the two providers at the Ann Deacon Center for Hope indicates they cannot go hands-on with an individual. So the Pfizer card that I was talking about that we had issued and so forth, and certainly follow-up discussion, is that an individual needs to be appropriate for a group interaction of some kind. And again, there's not necessarily group processes that are occurring, but being able to function in a group setting, as opposed to, if they are assaultive or combative at that point, then that is beyond the level of care that the Ann Deacon Center for Hope is actually licensed for. So you're absolutely correct.
Thank you. Deputy Chief Crass, do you see the officers using the Ann Deacon Center for Hope more than the hospital, or can you speak on that?
Like Perry alluded to, time is a huge factor for the officers. How long can they get in there? Because the longer they're there, the calls are stacking up, and sometimes they're more critical when they're there. And so they're looking to go where it's the smoothest process for them. They will use whatever is the smoothest. We would love to be able to take people that are going to behave. Oftentimes, sometimes it's the law enforcement that riles them up, and they calm down when they're in a setting like that. So sometimes you defer to the experts when you get in there, and they can say, just step away, and they're calm. And sometimes the minute we leave, then we're getting called back because they're not able to be in that group setting. So the officers, not to sound callous, they're looking to go and get on to the next. And so they want the person in the best hands, you know, and so they're going to use what's available. And it always seems to happen in the middle of the night, you know, when staffs are low. And so that's probably the highest demand for us. In the daytime, it's not as hard to find alternate spots for them to go if they can't fit in those, but it's always inevitably when there's not a lot of resources around. So we will use whatever is the smoothest sailing ship there.
Thank you.
Chief Tanksley.
Yes, I just want to second with what Chief Kress said, but also to highlight what Perry was talking about earlier with regard to the quick reference guide. And that card is a tremendous help to all law enforcement agencies here in Whatcom County, and especially for the agencies that are not near the core of downtown Bellingham. And it gives them the opportunity to, you know, call and talk to an admissions intake person right away. So it's going to save a tremendous amount of time. So we certainly appreciate that.
Thank you, Chief. Dan, you're on again.
Yeah, just a quick question regarding drop-off times with Pioneer and Compass. Is there anything in the contract that specifies that they need to have a quick turnaround? Is there anything that in the contract that states that they need to be, you know, less than 10 minutes for a drop-off or whatever the timing, or is that just not part of the arrangement?
It's a great question, and I don't want to answer inaccurately. I don't believe so, but I will go back and look specifically. One of the things that is a bit different than the historic triage facility, is what that was termed, is that Whatcom County owns the building, the Ann Deacon Center for Hope. They actually own the building and they lease it to Pioneer Human Services and Compass Health. And Pioneer Human Services and Compass Health are reimbursed for their services by Medicaid and or North Sound Behavioral Health. And so we didn't put a lot of detail into the contracts by virtue of the fact that the county does not actually pay for the service. So we didn't get into the specifics of that, but I will, I think that there is a general statement that they will, you know, that the providers will meet criteria necessary for the provision of crisis stabilization, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know that it broke out any of the specifics there, Councilmember Hamel, relative to the drop off. Now, we have discussed at length during these monthly meetings the goal and intent. And I think that the providers are fully cognizant and supportive of the goal and intent of a very limited time. We ran into, of course, the transportation thing, and it's like, hey, let's bring another resource to that so that we aren't in, you know, concern relative to holding law enforcement or their first responders for a ride. And they may not even know where to take the individual at that point in time. Not necessary for them to be involved in that role. We have those resources now to be able to handle that. So that's the information that I have, and I'll send that to Jill. I can send that to you, Councilmember Hamel, specifically that answer as I do the research.
I appreciate that. And then just a real quick follow-up question. Does ART, are they transporting folks to the Ann Deacon Center for Hope as well?
The alternative response team will certainly use the Ann Deacon Center for Hope and other resources within the community and have the ability to transport individuals within certain bounds, obviously, of safety and you know, and those kinds of components. So absolutely. Work very closely and communicate a pretty fair amount. That, and also the mobile crisis outreach team, which is, of course, Compass Health, our designated crisis responders utilization of the Ann Deacon Center for Hope.
Thanks.
Stephen, if you don't mind, there was one more thing that I wanted to mention because
Please.
we had such a good, robust discussion about this, but we actually had a public comment for the first time in many sessions. So one of our members of the public encouraged follow up with individuals who've utilized services for the Deacon Center for Hope to get some of those elements of feedback so that we can kind of get a user feel for it. So that was it, unless there was anything else.
That's very helpful. And I guess, Perry, in terms of that follow-up with utilizers, is that something that would come out of your shop or
I suspect that because of HIPAA and confidentiality, it would actually need to be sort of routed through, although I think it's a great idea. That is a discharge or a survey, being completed by an individual that is, departing the facility or has experienced an intake process. I think that I've mentioned it before. So, again, another shameless plug. There is also an online systems improvement form that I've actually gotten a number of different inputs from law enforcement and other first responders, GRACE and LEAD team members. Literally, the simplest way to find that is if you put in Crisis Stabilization Center feedback, it will pop up. It's on our county website, and it is a online form that can be filled out at any extent, and it comes directly to my email as well as my boss's email, and I follow those up if there's a problem or a challenge. Sometimes it's a very positive piece of feedback, and it's been invaluable, honestly. But it's not the survey that we're talking about. I just wanted to make reference to that it's really sort of users that can give us information. But I'm more than happy to bring that up in our next monthly meeting about, and it may to some extent be happening confidentiality wise, that can become a challenge, but obviously we can, generalize that and just look at feedback from individuals anonymously, if you will, for that. Right. So it's a great idea.
Great. Thank you. Caleb, that was it. All right. Thank you very much for that report. Mike, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you for the just quick moment. From Mike Hilly, EMS manager. And inside this conversation, I'm just compelled to remind everybody that the same challenges and barriers are existing for EMS in this diversion project. And I think we have a much larger opportunity, but more opportunity to be able to divert, especially our SUD, our overdoses over at the facility. But we have to have that 15-minute drop off, and it just takes too long for EMS. So I don't think we've navigated but maybe 2 people into that facility out of EMS over the last, since the facility was open. So just a reminder, I know it's incarceration prevention, but EMS has a bit of a stake in that facility too. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Perry, I'll just put a pin in the point that there were some qualms way back at the beginning with being the landlords only and not having a service contract with the providers. So we really sort of have no handle on the details of what would work ideally for incarceration prevention and reduction with them in a direct way. And I'm just wondering if there might be opportunities down the road to tweak the relationship and strengthen the expectations there to the extent that our history of utilization suggests something might be useful.
Yeah, it's a great point, Stephen. And one of the things that I do, and obviously I know with this group have reported in just in terms of subcommittee of the Deacon Center for Hope Crisis Stabilization Center, we do keep data, and actually I've been pretty pleased with what I've seen in terms of increasing utilization of beds up to a point of where in my opinion, we'll never reach 100% because it doesn't work that way. This is actually a count of, if you'll forgive the slang, heads in beds at midnight. That's when the count, actually occurs. Obviously, there's people discharging, people being admitted. There's a lot of various things that are going on there, but the utilization is up in that 70% range. I don't know 70% of available beds. I don't know how high we can necessarily get in terms of an absolute utilization, but I'm pretty pleased with that because it was not there when we initially opened and worked through a number of challenges. Also, my experience has been that both Pioneer Human Services and Compass Health have been very open to, you know, ideas and concepts of being very specific in terms of actions. That has been my experience with them. They are contained and bound, you know, to a certain extent by virtue of their state licensure level of care, that they can provide the hands-on, you know, they can't go hands-on, you know, et cetera, kind of component. And so I guess in one way, my current perspective is we can always improve, but I think that the nature and dynamic of the agreement and having providers, offer the service is working. And also, we do have lease agreements that do require, you know, provision of crisis services, you know, at a state level and, you know, and et cetera. So there are actually some, you know, components of understanding that are in the lease agreement of where, you know, if you will, the county certainly has the opportunity to say, hey, we're not renewing the lease because, you know, fill in the blank. So I hope that I answered your question, Stephen. And again, of course, I'm open to, you know, input and thought process about, you know, a different approach. It's really interesting at this point in time, you know, because we're talking, of course, about also development of a 23-hour crisis relief center, which I also believe will feed into the Ann Deacon Center for Hope and probably increase that capacity. You know, internally, I'm sort of hoping for, you know, what we begin to run into is challenges of we're at capacity. We can't take another individual. Not that I'm not wanting to serve individuals in the community, but that's a pretty good problem to be dealing with, is that we are, you know, up at that capacity. So anyway, all that being said, I'm certainly open to, you know, concepts and ideas, but pretty carefully tracking the utilization at this point. And those numbers are dramatically improved over the last year. But significantly improved from when the facilities first opened. Part of that was we were in COVID. We had workforce challenges and a number of other factors that, you know, came into play with that. So important question, Stephen.
I appreciate your openness, Perry, and your comments are helpful and informative. It suggests to me that we haven't had Crisis Stabilization Center advisory group reports in the same way that we've had committee reports. You've sort of had to carry that burden, and that's fine. But your mention of tracking data and compiling it quarterly, I'm just wondering whether that could be something that you share with the task force on a quarterly basis when you have that, so that we can have that information as well and just see what it is you're reporting on, or see if it raises any questions that we want to bring to your attention as well. It seems like there's more information to flow there than we've been having flow. So I'm just wondering if that would be an additional task you could take on for the task force.
Absolutely. I compile it out of my own interest in being essentially a liaison between, you know, the county, you know, owning the building and also supporting the providers. And so more than happy to, you know, to provide that quarterly information, as well as some of the highlights of the crisis stabilization monthly meeting as well. So happy to do that. I actually already compiled the information, so then I can impress you with my report out on that.
That would be great. And I'll just leave you and Jill to work out when and how to do that. Thank you. Heather.
Thank you. I'm so glad that this is being drilled into a little more. Thank you for all of your work on that. I am recalling that the primary successful user of the crisis center is the hospital, if I read that report right. And so I'm curious about, in the data, when you're doing that, Perry, if there's a way to capture cost savings to the hospital for when they have successful diversions, or if it isn't a cost savings, that'd be good to know too. And also, you know, is that I'm expecting that that's benefiting patient experience in other ways too, if we can successfully divert people to a different place of care that's more appropriate. But I do think that when, when people first established this idea, the idea wasn't to help the hospital so much as it was to divert people from incarceration. And I know we get stuck at licensure. I'm understanding that. And maybe this is a committee level conversation, but it would be so good to understand the different options of licensure that are available to us. And if we're just stuck there with that eligibility that makes the incarceration diversion a little more challenging. And if we are stuck, then is there, like, let's make sure we understand those lessons learned for the 23-hour or the next project so that we aren't stuck in the future too, or maybe that becomes a legislative agenda item as well, that can we switch this licensure criteria so that we can have more successful law enforcement and EMS utilization. But I think that cost savings both to the taxpayers and to the hospital would be a really interesting measure to capture.
Excellent points, Heather. Thank you very much. Barry.
Yeah, and I think the one other thing we brought up, especially when we were talking about the potential of a survey out to our law enforcement and EMS utilizers, that we would also talk to the operators on how we can make that exchange, how the drop-offs could be smoother, but including them in the conversation, I think would be important. And we did touch on that a little bit at the end of the index meeting.
Thanks, Barry. That's a valuable addition. Raylene.
Just to add on to Barry's conversation, I think they wanted to, when we were discussing it at the index committee, it was brought up that maybe we should talk to the providers first before we went out and did a survey of law enforcement and EMS to see what their problems were and why they were turning away people and what we could do to make easier access, and then to survey law enforcement and EMS. And Wendy really noted on that. Thanks.
So that seems to be a task that had a good bit of interest and energy behind it. Caleb, are you carrying that forward, or is it in Perry's lap, or how do you see that?
Well, I feel like there's a component for index here, but a lot of it is a bit more abstract than gathering data. So I want to continue to push for the data gathering side through index, but it sounds like there are components that will be in Perry's wheelhouse that it sounds like he's already on top of as well. So I don't want to misspeak, but there were elements of that were a little bit more abstract than simple data collection.
Yeah, that sounds right. So Perry, you had your hand up beforehand. Could you add commenting to this survey and feedback kind of issue? How to implement them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really good idea. As a matter of fact, I mean, the thought strikes me that I have, reached out and had some communication with various law enforcement offices. And sometimes what I've run into is, individuals that had worked with or experienced, again, I'll sort of make reference to the triage facility, the Whatcom County triage facility prior to the Ann Deacon Center for Hope, and had kind of experienced that it really didn't work for them. And they went, okay, I've checked that off my list, I'm moving on, and didn't realize a new resource, a new facility, and that we're focused on this as a diversion process. So that being said, when we were kind of talking about, hey, maybe an informational session for law enforcement and just to give information prior to a survey with law enforcement, only because of the fact that we can make sure that education and information is there. So we're not surveying historic conclusions, if that makes sense, with law enforcement. So anyway, I thought maybe I'd reach out to Caleb, and maybe that's not the right way to do it in terms of how do I set this up? I don't know all, I mean, I know, some of the primary, law enforcement representatives, of course, but I don't know all of who needs to be at that meeting or who would best be at that meeting. Sometimes, the upper structure, is, I know the shift sergeants can be amazingly important to be involved there and so forth. So any advice that I can get is what I'm after, of who I should invite, and not, set up something that's not going to be helpful for, those entities. So hopefully I answered your question, Stephen, and got my question in there as well of advice.
Yes, you did. And I would just suggest sort of presumptively that you have Caleb and Deputy Chief Crass and Chief Tank here as an advisory committee as you figure out how to spread that information through the law enforcement agencies. Raylene, you have your hand up.
Just to touch on that, Perry, if it's something that you're interested in, maybe we could put it as a topic for the Legal and Justice Subcommittee and ask some of those people to join us at one of those meetings to see how we can move forward on this. And if Caleb's willing to help on that, I think that might be beneficial.
Happy to help too.
Great. Good idea, Raylene. And Raylene, I think that concludes the index report. Thank you, everybody, for that discussion. Raylene, I'm going to turn it over to you for Legal and Justice Systems Committee report.
Thank you. We touched on this earlier a little bit with Kayla, but basically the focus on the Legal and Justice Subcommittee meeting on August 8th was the staffing levels at the Public Defender's Office, which actually did end up including the prosecutor's office, which is beneficial that we need assistance in both areas. And everybody has a constitutional right to be defended, but we also need prosecutors, and there is definitely a shortage of attorneys statewide, nationwide. And attorneys are going to go somewhere that pay well and give them good benefits and don't have caseload and burnout issues. So the Supreme Court case standards were brought up on what they're required to do. Currently, the American Bar Association is looking at updating those, which may make them more stringent, and the Washington State Bar Association may be adopting those standards as well. So right now there is a shortage of attorneys with the Public Defender's Office, and they can only do certain things. ARPA is helping to keep them afloat, but that funding is going to run out at the end of 2024. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that, Maya. Also, Maya pointed out that the prosecutors or the state should dismiss charges on individuals without prejudice and refile when they're not being adequately represented or not represented at all at this time. That leads to other issues in triage that I would not want to be in the prosecutor's shoes to decide what cases needed to be dismissed. I also wouldn't want to be a judge on a case having to determine whether a case should be dismissed and refiled concerning public safety and community issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Maya if she wants to add more onto that. It's definitely something that's concerning to legal and justice.
Thanks. The new standards were published, and there's been a few articles that you can find about them. I'm going to send Jill an article that came out on Sunday. I think it was published on Sunday by Anita Kandawal and in the Times, the Seattle Times, about the situation that's happening in King County. And it's a good op-ed, and it sets out sort of some of the numbers that are likely to be coming should Washington adopt these new standards. So I'll get that sent around.
Thank you, Maya. Eric?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add that in Whatcom County, we have the highest felony caseloads in the state. We're at about 187 cases per felony deputy, when the average in our comparable counties are about 70. It's it's insane how far off we are from the norm. I just want everybody to be aware of that.
Thank you, Eric. And I'm just going from history purposes on this, Eric, but when you get cases that are booked, you have to deal with those cases first. There's a priority when somebody goes to jail, but then when cases are referred off to the prosecutor's office, that's where you're sorting through to determine which ones take priority. Am I correct on that?
Well, you're right on a lot of you're pretty much right.
So it's just concerning that there's cases that are sitting there that are waiting to determine whether they can prosecute, file charges, if charges needed to be filed. And I'm certain that officers don't write reports to send to the prosecutors for no reason. And there's always victims that are involved in these as well. So I'm concerned on both fronts. I want people to be adequately represented. I don't want to violate anybody's constitutional rights, but I also want the prosecutor's office to be able to do their jobs and make sure the community is happy with the standard of care. So I don't know if there's anything else that we need to touch on, but that's pretty much what was discussed at the last legal injustice meeting, and I look forward to that report that Maya will be sending out. If anybody else has any other feedback on that, I'd be happy to hear that. Thank you.
Thanks, Raylene. I'll just jump in with one other point. One of the things that struck me in the committee discussion, and it was mentioned in the op-ed piece, which I'm glad Maya is circulating, was in the public defender side. It's not just gross staffing, but there are requirements for the level of cases that you can take, and the public defender's office has added someone to help out with the caseload, but that person can't take the most serious felonies for defense, and so this starts to look like a balloon where you push on one side and it pops out on the other. So we know from who's being detained in jail pre-trial the seriousness of the crimes that Eric has reported to us over the last few months. We don't have defenders, especially for them, and so that remains a bottleneck, even if we added some lower level public defenders. So there are layers to the problems that we're dealing with, and I'm not at all in a position to understand what potential solutions might be, but as with most things we deal with, it's a more complicated situation than it even appears to be at first.
Thank you, Stephen. That's pretty much spot on. In addition to that, I noticed Carl Munson is now working for the public defense, which is a great addition, and I'm happy to hear that. But the concern is now that he is working for the Whatcom County Public Defender's Office, he's one less person that can be used for conflict cases. So it seems like you fix one little spot and it also creates a hole somewhere else. So we need to bring more attorneys into the county that are willing to work for both offices. Thanks.
Thanks for that report, Raylene. And thank you, Eric and Maya, for your contributions. Barry, I'm going to turn it over to you for steering committee update.
Thanks, Stephen. And as almost in every other meeting that we have, the steering committee's pretty much been covered by today's agenda items. But I wanted to circle back to one that I'm really excited about, and that was the one Mike Parker brought up about this Denver-based supportive housing initiative. And it's a pay for performance thing, is how Mike described it. And I see he had to get off. I was hoping he could give us a little bit more of a teaser to what we can expect to see when we have a presentation. But Executive Sadhu, you're on, and you mentioned that the county had been working on a social impact fund idea, I think with Whatcom Community Foundation, that had a similar feel to it as far as like this pay for performance concept. So maybe you could give us a little preview of what you guys have been working on.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan. I would say that I did read the papers. I think Mike sent us about the Denver one, and our idea is a little bit different. It was basically started with for affordable housing as a main theme than other services or anything. The idea was that if about 50 people can put $100,000 each, we can have a serious seed money for this fund. Whereas Whatcom Community Foundation would be the administrator or take on because of their experience to do this. And this conversation was held with some of the large developers in our community. And they said they are willing to look at something like this. And we were trying now through a consultant to make it eligible for pension funds so that, or 401k, so that, like, suppose there is a big developer in our community. He has 200 employees. So they have a large 401k, which is being invested with, Merrill Lynch or all these big New York companies. They can take a small portion, even like 3 to 5%, and invest in this fund because it will be 401k eligible. If few of the companies do that, and you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars they have in their pension fund, 401k, and they can take a small piece and put it in there, then we can come up with a $50 million social impact fund. And they will have a board of director, which will work. We haven't figured the total structure yet, but Whatcom Community Foundation is willing to facilitate something of that sort because they have nonprofit status, and they can make it separate fund on the side, which is managed by a committee of people. County, as Whatcom County is also exploring through our trader, that can we take a 1 or 2% of our reserve funds, which Treasury manages, and put $5 million as county invest in that. Now, this will not be a charity fund. This will not be a giving grants to people. It will give low interest loans for supporting affordable housing projects. Just imagine that if private, because the whole idea is to bring the private sector into this arena of low income housing. Because right now, low income housing is we only stretching some local EDI money or ARPA money, and then we go to state housing fund or Bellingham city fund and or HUD and all this. There is no, or other philanthropic dollars, put it this way, but there is no way that private sector is engaged in financing of those things. So what this fund can do, this $50 million, they can, if a private investor says we are building 400 apartments, and we will commit 20% of those apartments for affordable housing or affordable apartments, then this fund will give them proportionate or some way, either utilities or something, they will give them a long-term loan at 1 or 2%, like what we're doing from EDI. So this will be like a mezzanine financing for them. So a portion of that, and their commitment is they will pay back this money, as well they will have that 20% of those affordable housing, which will be managed not by this group. They can be managed by Opportunity Council or somebody, whatever structures we have. They will designate that 10 apartments on each floor. They will be split out or spread throughout the building. They will not be, oh, we're gonna just build one building and stigmatize that, oh, this is the low income apartment. So they will be spread out in there, and some other entity can manage with the criteria, income criteria, eligibility, family, kids, and all this kind of stuff. So then they will have this way of getting this money back, and slowly over time, it could become a revolving fund. And whatever 1-2% they are getting, part of that a dividend can be paid to these 401ks, because right now that's what they are getting, 0.25%. Like I started this thing in 2020, as a matter of fact, and we were not getting even a 0.25% on our monies with these companies. So the idea was that if it can be 1 to 2%, it could be positive for them. But at the same time, they were committed that they're not giving out the money, they're loaning the money. So they are doing community good as well as they are getting their money is secure, because they decide the collateral, they decide, and some cases, they may be the same people who are put the money into this thing and who are getting these loans. So that was the overall concept. And then, of course, it kind of went on sideways. And I have engaged with Maury Ingram actually last week. So this month, we're going to have another meeting and see where we can lead this to. So this is very preliminary, but that's where we are. That's the thought process.
Yeah, and that's great to hear that we're engaged in those conversations. And I think this Denver, it is a little different, but it's similar in nature as it involves the private sector. And there's actually, as Mike mentioned, that the investors actually receive some return on their investment that was actually fairly significant. So looking forward to seeing, that group come in and give us an idea of what they're doing in Denver. I think they're focused on supportive housing on this project. They're drilled into that lane. So Jill's working on getting that into a future task force meeting. Well, anyway, Stephen, that was all I had. I just wanted to put a fine point on what Mike had mentioned and share that enthusiasm. And thanks, Executive Sadhu, for letting us know what's going on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for fleshing out that topic, Barry, and thank you, Executive Sadhu, for the background. The Denver situation was focused on justice-involved individuals and not affordable housing in the broader scope. So I think that is something the steering committee wants to keep an eye on, and we are trying to bring in someone involved in the evaluation. And this came into the public eye because the project was actually a time-limited project that was completed a couple of years ago. What just hit the news and caught Mike's attention was quite a rigorous evaluation study, the outcomes of that project, and it was pretty uniformly positive, and so we are gonna keep exploring that from the task force perspective, and look forward to where that may go.
Yeah, and that's the cool part, Stephen. There's already data available on this effort, so we can see some of the outcomes.
Exactly, and we'll learn a little bit more about that if we can bring in the speaker we're trying to make connections with. So I think that's it for committee reports. The next agenda item is whether anyone has other business not listed so far to bring up. And seeing none, then we'll, oh, I'm sorry, Jill.
Sure, thank you, Stephen. I just wanted to remind everyone that there's a special full task force meeting scheduled for October 9th, Monday, October 9th at 9 a.m. The task force will receive a presentation from Washington State University on their progress report on the VERA recommendations.
Thank you so much for remembering that and for reminding us to get that on our calendars. So for public comment, I'll just go back over our caution per RCW 42.17A.555. The use of public facilities like the task force to support or oppose candidates or ballot issues is prohibited. Members of the public are not allowed to speak in support of or in opposition to a ballot measure or individual candidacy during an open public meeting such as this. Please refrain from raising campaign issues when addressing the task force. And so I'll ask Jill if you would invite public comments from any attendees.
Yes, thank you. We have a number of attendees today. If any of you would like to speak to the task force, please virtually raise your hand now by selecting the raise hand icon or by pressing *9 on your phone. And I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, I'll just, speaking to the attendees, I'll just add that our invitations for input on potential candidates for applying for membership in the task force or for possible leadership positions is certainly available to input that any of you, even though you're not task force members right now, might want to submit. So you can get any ideas you have for people you think would be worth exploring. You can get that directly to Jill, and you have the email address to reach her with that. So with no public comment and no other business, we've completed our work for the day, and I'll adjourn the meeting forthwith. Thank you, everybody.